Ma'am, with all due respect, that pin looks fake. You can't buy respect at the PX. The voice of Master Sergeant Davies, sharp and condescending, cut through the crisp morning air at the West Point security checkpoint. A ripple of nervous snickers went through the line of ramrod straight cadets behind the woman. They were young, impressionable, and Davies was their gatekeeper, the embodiment of the rigid standards they aspired to. They saw a small, unassuming woman in simple civilian clothes, a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, being called out by a man whose chest was a billboard of validated service, his uniform crisp, his every ribbon and badge perfectly aligned. The woman, Sarah Morgan, did not flinch. She did not argue. Her gaze, which had been resting on the distant, Gothic spires of the cadet chapel, remained placid. She offered no defense, no explanation, her stillness a stark contrast to the Master Sergeant's puffed-up indignation. Her hands, resting lightly on the handle of a simple leather briefcase, were perfectly steady. There was a profound calm about her, a silence that seemed to absorb his aggression rather than reflect it. But Davies saw only weakness, an opportunity to perform his authority. He saw a civilian trying to trade on a legacy that wasn't hers. The pin in question, affixed to her lapel, was the source of his contempt. It was small, matte black, shaped like a cross with subtly swept wings, utterly devoid of the polished gold or gleaming enamel that characterized official military decorations. It looked like something from a surplus store, a cheap imitation meant to fool the ignorant. As Davies continued his tirade, his voice rising for the benefit of his audience of cadets, a figure watched from the shaded portico of the administration building. Colonel Thompson, the academy's superintendent, paused his conversation with a visiting dignitary. He saw the scene unfolding at the gate, the classic friction between rigid procedure and the unpredictable human element. He saw Davies, a man he knew to be competent, but overly zealous, a man still growing into the authority of his new rank. And he saw the woman. He saw her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, subtle parade rest posture that was second nature to the deeply disciplined. He saw her silence, a quiet professionalism that felt more authentic than the loudest boast. And then his eyes, sharpened by decades of experience, narrowed on the small, dark pin on her lapel. A jolt went through him, a ghost of a memory from a classified briefing in a windowless room years ago. A memory of a symbol very few had ever seen, and even fewer understood. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type competence below. Master Sergeant Davies mistook her silence for shame, a common error of the arrogant. He felt a surge of self-righteousness, believing he was defending the honor of the institution from a charlatan. "We have a code here, ma'am," he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the morning stillness. "It's called stolen valor. People bleed for the right to wear decorations on this post. They earn them with sweat and sacrifice, not with a credit card." He gestured dismissively at the pin. "That thing is an insult to every man and woman in uniform." He was building his sermon, enjoying the rapt attention of the cadets. He was teaching them a lesson, he thought, about vigilance, about pride, about the clear and visible line between those who belong and those who do not. Sarah Morgan simply blinked, her expression unchanging. She seemed to be observing him with a detached curiosity, like a scientist studying a particularly loud and agitated specimen. Her lack of reaction was infuriating. It was as if his words, his authority, his very presence, were failing to register on her reality. This infuriating calm only goaded him further. "Driver's license and invitation, please," he snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. She complied without a word, retrieving a simple ID and a formal, embossed invitation from her briefcase. He snatched them from her hand. "Sarah Morgan," he read aloud, then scoffed. "Doesn't ring a bell." And this invitation could be a forgery. He was digging himself a deeper and deeper hole, blinded by his initial assumption. He was so focused on the symbol he considered fake that he failed to notice the subtle tells of her authenticity. The worn, creased leather of her briefcase handle, shaped by countless hours of being held with a firm, confident grip. The faint, pale line on her left wrist where a watch had been worn for years, a testament to a life lived by the second. The way her eyes scanned the entire area, not just him, taking in the rooftops. The traffic flow, the posture of the other guards, a constant, unconscious threat assessment that was as natural to her as breathing. Davy saw none of this. He saw a plain woman and a cheap pin, and his entire world of rigid, superficial judgment clicked shut around that one flawed perception. I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the line, ma'am. We need to verify your credentials. It could take some time. It was a power play, a final, public humiliation designed to make her break, to make her argue, to give him the satisfaction of a victory. But she simply nodded, understood, Master Sergeant, and with a quiet grace that was more damning than any insult, she stepped aside, her silence holding more power and dignity than all his loud, empty words combined. The moment stretched into a tense, awkward tableau. The line of cadets shuffled, the initial amusement curdling into discomfort. Davy stood with his arms crossed, a smug sentinel guarding the gates of authenticity. Sarah Morgan stood perfectly still, her back to a low stone wall, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if this delay was a minor, expected inconvenience in a world filled with them. It was then that the universe decided to test Master Sergeant Davies' definition of competence. A black sedan, part of a diplomatic convoy that had been cleared moments earlier, suddenly lurched forward from its holding position. Instead of accelerating smoothly, its engine screamed with a high, unnatural whine. Black smoke belched from the exhaust as the vehicle careened forward, its tires screeching on the asphalt. The driver was slumped over the wheel, his body convulsing, a seizure or a heart attack. The car was no longer a vehicle. It was a 2-ton missile aimed directly at a group of cadets' families waiting near the visitors' pavilion. Panic erupted. People screamed and scattered. The guards at the gate fumbled for their radios, their training momentarily eclipsed by the shock of the sudden, real-world crisis. Davies himself froze for a critical second, his mind struggling to process the chaotic scene. His authority, so potent just moments before, was utterly useless against the physics of a runaway car. But Sarah Morgan did not panic. She did not scream. She moved. The transition from absolute stillness to fluid motion was so swift it was almost imperceptible. For her, the world didn't descend into chaos. It sharpened into a set of clear, solvable problems. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of crisis management, instantly calculated vectors, velocities, and potential points of impact. Her eyes darted from the car to the crowd, to the heavy concrete barricades lining the road, to the flagpole with its thick steel base. She saw not chaos, but a geometry of salvation. Her movements were an exhibition of pure, unadulterated efficiency. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. She ran not with a desperate sprint of fear, but with the purposeful, ground-eating stride of someone who knows exactly where they are going and why. Her blazer, a moment ago a symbol of her civilian status, was now just fabric in motion as she closed the distance to the out-of-control vehicle. The cadets and guards who had been mocking her just moments before now stood frozen, watching in stunned disbelief as the quiet, unassuming woman became the calm, decisive center of the storm. While others saw a disaster unfolding, Sarah saw a sequence. Her first action was not aimed at the car, but at the people. She didn't shout a warning. She used precise, universally understood hand signals, the kind used by air traffic controllers on a carrier deck or by breachers stacking up on a door. A sharp, pointing gesture, a slicing motion with her hand, commands that bypassed the panicked brain and spoke directly to instinct. People moved, scrambling out of the car's path, not even consciously aware of why they were obeying the silent commands of a stranger. Her focus then shifted to the vehicle. She knew stopping it with brute force was impossible. The key was redirection. She sprinted towards the guard post, her target the emergency spike strip stored in its bright yellow case. Davies had trained his men to deploy it in a team of 2, a process that took a practice 7 seconds. Sarah grabbed the deployment cord, her hands a blur of practice motion. She didn't throw it across the entire road. That would take too long and could cause the vehicle to flip, creating an even more dangerous situation. Instead, With a flick of her wrist born from thousands of hours of training, she unspooled just enough of the strip to cover the path of the driver's side tires. It was an act of surgical precision, like a fencer's lunge. The spikes hit the asphalt just as the sedan's front wheel reached them. The tire blew with a percussive bang. The car, its steering now compromised, began to pull sharply to the left, away from the crowd and towards the solid granite base of the Academy flagpole. It was a perfect, calculated move, but she wasn't done. The car was still moving too fast. As it careened past her, she moved with it. In a motion that was impossibly fast, she slammed the heel of her hand against the rear passenger window, striking the corner with a precise, focused impact. The tempered glass didn't just crack, it spiderwebbed and disintegrated into 1,000 harmless cubes, a textbook application of physics that security professionals spend weeks learning. Before the glass had even finished falling, she reached through the empty frame, her arm finding the door handle from the inside, and wrenched it open. She didn't try to get in. She simply leaned in far enough to knock the gear shift into neutral with a swift, downward strike. The engine roared, disconnected from the wheels. The car, now coasting on a flat tire in its own momentum, finally slammed into the flagpole's base with a jarring, metallic crunch. It stopped. The entire sequence, from the moment she started moving to the final impact, had taken less than 12 seconds. In the deafening silence that followed, broken only by the hiss of the ruined engine and a single, mournful car alarm, Sarah Morgan was already leaning into the car, her fingers on the driver's neck, checking for a pulse. A profound, echoing silence descended upon the scene, a vacuum where panic had been only seconds before. The cadets, the families, the guards, everyone stood frozen, their minds struggling to replay the impossible sequence of events they had just witnessed. They saw the crumpled hood of the sedan pressed against the flagpole. They saw the deflated tire lying on the shredded spike strip. They saw the shattered window. And they saw the woman, Sarah Morgan, calmly speaking into the driver's radio, which she had pulled from his belt, relaying his medical condition and location to emergency services with cool, technical precision. Her voice was steady, devoid of the adrenaline that was causing everyone else's heart to pound in their chests. Master Sergeant Davies stood by his guard post, his mouth agape. The rule book he lived by, the world of neat lines and clear-cut authority, had been utterly and completely incinerated. He had seen a threat where there was none and had been blind to the quiet, lethal competence that stood right in front of him. The woman he had dismissed as a poser, a faker, had just single-handedly prevented a catastrophe with a level of skill and composure he had only ever read about in after-action reports from elite units. The word professional felt woefully inadequate. Ow, he whispered to himself, the word lost in the sudden return of ambient sound as people began to stir, sirens wailing in the distance. The public performance of his authority had crumbled into a private, soul-crushing humiliation. It was into this stunned silence that Colonel Thompson strode, his steps measured and deliberate. He moved with an aura of absolute command, his presence parting the gawking crowd like a ship through water. He ignored the wrecked car. He ignored the approaching medics. He ignored the stammering guards. His eyes were fixed on only one person. He walked directly to Sarah Morgan, who had just finished securing the scene and was stepping back from the vehicle. He stopped 2 paces in front of her. He did not ask what happened. He didn't need to. He had seen it all. His gaze dropped from her calm, impassive face to the small, dark pin on her lapel. In the bright morning sun, he could now see the details he had only glimpsed from a distance. The subtle, aerodynamic sweep of the wings, the intricate etching on the cross, the way the dark, non-reflective metal seemed to absorb the light. It was exactly as he remembered from that briefing. A symbol of an action that officially never happened for a group that officially didn't exist. The colonel's face, normally a stern mask of command, softened with an expression of profound, almost reverent respect. He slowly, deliberately brought his hand up in a salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture he gave to subordinates 100 times a day. This was a salute of deep, personal deference, crisp, and held with a ramrod stillness that spoke volumes. It was the salute a soldier gives not to rank, but to legend. For a long, silent moment. He held it, the four-star general's aide and the other dignitaries behind him watching in confused awe. The highest-ranking officer on the post was saluting an unknown civilian woman in a blazer. The message was unmistakable, even if the reason was a mystery. "Ma'am," Colonel Thompson said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the silent plaza. "It is an honor to have you at this institution." He finally lowered his hand. Sarah Morgan simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. "Colonel," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. Davies, finally shaking himself from his stupor, hurried over. "Sir, we had a situation. This woman, her credentials weren't," he stammered, his authority completely gone, his voice now pleading for understanding. The colonel turned his head slowly, and the look he gave Davies was colder than the winter wind off the Hudson River. "The situation, Master Sergeant, appears to be resolved," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And the only issue with credentials I see right now is your spectacular failure to recognize them." He turned back to Sarah. "My apologies for my NCOs. Zeal, ma'am." He then looked pointedly at Davies. "You question her pin, I understand." Davies paled, nodding mutely. The colonel held out his hand to his aide. "Major, bring up the classified guest lecture file for today." "Authorization Thompson 770. The major tapped on his tablet and handed it to the colonel. The colonel scanned it for a moment, then looked directly at the circle of stunned cadets and guards who had gathered. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a battlefield command. "A lesson in assumptions and a lesson in respect." He held up the tablet, though the screen was visible only to him. "This is Sarah Morgan. Her rank is redacted. Her unit is redacted. Most of her service record is composed of black ink. But let me read you what I am permitted to share." The colonel's voice became a measured, impactful cadence, each word landing like a hammer blow on the fragile arrogance that had filled the air moments before. Commendations include the Distinguished Intelligence Cross, the CIA's Intelligence Star, and a Bronze Star with V4 Valor, earned while on detached duty with Naval Special Warfare Development Group. She has over 5,000 hours as a lead analyst and field operator for a Joint Special Operations Task Force that you're not cleared to know exists. Her mission classifications are at a level that requires presidential authority. He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, the silence of the crowd absolute. The cadets' faces were a mixture of shock and awe. The name DevGru alone was enough to create a legend, but the rest of it was from a world they could barely imagine. Davies looked as though he had been physically struck. His entire perception of this woman had been so profoundly wrong it called into question every judgment he had ever made. The colonel wasn't finished. His eyes went from the tablet back to the small, dark pin on Sarah's lapel. "You were right about one thing, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice laced with ice. "You cannot buy that pin at the PX. You can't be awarded it in a ceremony. Most people who are qualified for it don't survive to receive it." He took a deep breath. "That is the Archangel's Cross. It is not an official military decoration, which is why it's not in your regulations book. It is a peer-given honor established under a classified charter, awarded to an individual who, through an act of profound strategic intervention outside a declared combat theater, prevents a catastrophic loss of life or a critical failure of national security. It is awarded in secret. The records are sealed. There is no parade." He looked around at the faces staring back at him, ensuring every single person understood the gravity of his next words. "Since its inception 30 years ago, it has been given out exactly 4 times. One was awarded posthumously to a Delta Force operator killed in the Hindu Kush. One was given to the CIA director who unraveled the Black Swan conspiracy. One sits on the desk of a retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And the 4th," he turned his gaze back to Sarah Morgan, his voice filled with an unmistakable reverence, "was awarded to Ms. Morgan for actions in Istanbul that are, and will remain, completely classified. You didn't recognize it, Master Sergeant, because you were never meant to. You were meant to recognize the quiet professionalism of a guest on this post. You saw a pin you didn't know, and you assumed it was fake. A true professional would have assumed their own knowledge was incomplete." He then fixed Davies with a final, withering glare. Your job is to identify threats, not to indulge your ego. Today you failed on both counts. Report to my office at 1,500 hours. Dismissed. The story of what happened at the Thayer Gate spread through West Point like wildfire. It wasn't transmitted through official channels, but through the far more efficient network of cadet gossip and barracks rumor. By lunchtime, every plebe and First High knew the tale. They knew about the arrogant master sergeant, the quiet civilian woman, the runaway car, and the impossible 12-second display of hypercompetence. The details became mythologized with each telling. The car was going faster. The crowd was bigger. Her actions were even more miraculous. But the core of the story, the central, humbling lesson, remained intact. The legend of the Archangel's Cross was born. It became a cautionary tale whispered to new cadets, a powerful reminder that the most dangerous people often make the least noise, and that true merit is not always advertised with gleaming brass and colorful ribbons. The phrase "check for the cross" became a new piece of academy slang, a shorthand way of telling someone to check their assumptions and to look beyond the superficial. It was a call for humility, a recognition that the world was filled with quiet professionals whose legacies were written in redacted ink. Master Sergeant Davies, as ordered, reported to the colonel's office at 1,500 hours. He did not get yelled at. What he received was far worse. He was met with a quiet, disappointed lecture from Colonel Thompson about the true meaning of leadership. It wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about embodying principles. It wasn't about projecting authority. It was about demonstrating wisdom. Davies left the office a broken man, but not a destroyed one. The experience had shattered his pride, but in its place, something new and better began to grow. The next week, he was seen personally drilling a group of new security guards at the gate. He wasn't yelling. He was speaking quietly, using his own monumental failure as the primary teaching tool. Your biggest vulnerability is not a gap in the fence, he told them, his voice heavy with the weight of his own experience. It's a gap in your perception. You look for the obvious threat, the loud one. But the real threat and the greatest ally can be the one you dismiss. Never, ever assume you know the whole story. He had been publicly humbled, but in that humiliation, he found a new, more profound sense of duty. He became a better NCO, a better mentor, and a better man. Meanwhile, Sarah Morgan's original purpose for being at the academy was fulfilled. She was the keynote speaker for the annual symposium on military ethics and intelligence. The auditorium, which was usually only half full for such events, was packed to the rafters. Cadets stood in the aisles and sat on the steps. Every instructor was present. Even Colonel Thompson sat in the front row. When she was introduced, the applause was thunderous and sustained. She walked to the podium, dressed in the same simple blazer and slacks. The Archangel's Cross, a small, dark speck on her lapel. She waited for the applause to die down, her expression as calm and unreadable as it had been at the gate. Everyone was waiting for her to mention the morning's events, to tell her side of the story. They wanted to hear the tale from the legend herself, but she never mentioned it. Not once. Her lecture was a quiet, philosophical, and deeply technical exploration of the moral gray areas faced by intelligence operators. She spoke of the weight of secrets, the burden of acting on incomplete information, and the profound moral clarity required to make life-or-death decisions in silence and isolation. She spoke of the concept of the quiet professional, the individual whose greatest victories are never known, whose name is never celebrated, and whose only reward is the knowledge that their actions preserve the lives of others. True honor, she said, her voice steady and clear, is not found in the recognition you receive. It is found in the integrity of the actions you take when no one is watching. It is a private conversation between you and your conscience. The cadets listened in rapt, absolute silence. Her words, already powerful, were now backed by the undeniable proof of her character. She wasn't just teaching a theory, she was embodying a philosophy. Her actions at the gate had been the perfect, unspoken preface to her entire speech. After the lecture, as she was being escorted from the auditorium, a young female cadet approached her, her face filled with awe. "Ma'am," the cadet said nervously, "what you did this morning, It was the most incredible thing I've ever seen. Sarah Morgan paused and looked at the young woman. She offered a small, rare smile. "What I did this morning was my job, cadet," she said simply. "Now go and learn how to do yours." In the guardhouse at Thayer Gate, the damaged security barricade was replaced. But one of the guards, a young specialist who had witnessed the entire event, retrieved a twisted piece of the metal from the scrap heap. He mounted on a piece of polished wood and hung it on the wall. Underneath it, he affixed a small, hand-stamped brass plate with 3 words: "The Morgan Stop." It became an unofficial monument, a permanent, physical reminder of the day a quiet woman taught an entire institution that competence speaks for itself. A year passed. The seasons turned on the Hudson Highlands, bringing a new class of plebes to the hallowed grounds of West Point. At the Thayer Gate, a new group of young soldiers stood guard, their uniforms stiff, their faces a mixture of pride and nervousness. An older, more thoughtful Master Sergeant Davies was conducting their final briefing before their first official shift. He stood them before the simple, unofficial plaque on the wall, the one with the twisted piece of metal. "Before you check your first ID," he began, his voice quiet and steady. "You look at this. This is the Morgan Stop. It's not in any official history book, but it's the most important piece of history in this guardhouse." He then told them the story. He didn't spare himself, detailing his own arrogance, his flawed assumptions, and the swift, silent, and utterly complete way in which he was proven wrong. He told them about the unassuming woman, the runaway car, and the small, dark pin that meant more than a chest full of medals. "Your job here is not just to keep people out," he told them, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "It's to let the right people in. And you will not always be able to tell who is who by what they wear or what's written on their ID. You have to learn to see beyond the uniform. You have to learn to recognize quiet competence. You have to learn to respect the silence. Because sometimes the most important person to walk through this gate will be the one who has nothing to prove the lesson had been institutionalized." Davies, through his own humbling, had transformed a moment of personal failure into a powerful and enduring teaching tool. The story of Sarah Morgan had become a part of the Academy's living folklore, a modern parable for a new generation of leaders. Colonel Thompson, in his annual address to the incoming class, now included the story in his speech. He would stand before the sea of new faces and speak of the values they were expected to uphold. "We will teach you tactics here," he would say, his voice echoing in the great hall. "We will teach you strategy. We will teach you history. But the most important lesson you will learn is one of humility. The lesson of the Morgan Stop. The knowledge that the person standing next to you, regardless of their rank or appearance, may hold a strength and a story you cannot possibly comprehend. Your duty is to have the wisdom to recognize it and the honor to respect it." The legacy of that single morning radiated outwards, becoming more than just a story. It became a cultural touchstone, a quiet shift in the institution's DNA. It was a reminder that the true strength of the military wasn't in its rigid hierarchies or its gleaming awards, but in the quiet, unseen, and often unrewarded competence of its best people. The Archangel's Cross was never seen at the Academy again, but its ghost remained. It was a symbol of a different kind of valor measured not in enemies defeated, but in disasters averted, not in battles won, but in a peace preserved through silent, thankless work. Sarah Morgan never returned to West Point. Her name was just a whisper in a lecture hall, a story told by a humbled NCO at a security gate. She was back in the shadows, in the silent, high-stakes world where she belonged, her work known only to a select few. But her impact remained. She had left behind more than just a memory. She had left behind a standard. She had proven in one brief, explosive demonstration that character is not defined by the symbols you wear, but by the actions you take when everything is on the line. She showed that true authority comes from demonstrated ability, not from a title or a rank. The ultimate legacy of that day was not the stopped car or the humbled sergeant. It was the quiet seed of wisdom planted in the minds of hundreds of future leaders. They would go on to their own careers, carrying with them the story of the woman with the fake-looking pin, a permanent reminder that the most valuable weapon in any arsenal is a humble and observant mind. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a display case. It's what continues forward in the actions and beliefs of others. It is the quiet competence that inspires more quiet competence, a silent chain of professionalism stretching from one generation to the next, unseen, unheard, but always, always present. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud assumption, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.